If not, then I would like to ask all the speakers to join us in this panel session. And then we can still address your questions or topics that you would like to discuss. Please, if you have any, not a question, but a topic that you think this is of interest that I would like to see as a discussion in the panel session, raise those topics, raise your questions. I have a few questions on my list, so I will start with that, but then we'll go back to the audience. So please take a seat. There's one for you. No, that. Okay. Let me start with my first question, and then again, please feel free to pose your questions or topics you would like this panel session to discuss. First question. We heard a lot about certification frameworks, certification schemes, already existing approach for smart metering. And as we are used to in the energy sector, we are always thinking about money. So what does it cost? What is the economic value? What does it bring? How much money do we save? So that is my first question. What could be the potential economic results of a certification approach, a certification framework? So what is your answer on, okay, where is the economic value of this certification? Who wants to start? There is a microphone there. Oh, yeah,
hello?
Yeah, works.
Is it working?
Yeah, we use this for the audience.
Okay. So I can answer for the smart meter. In that sense, we have chosen common criteria. Not at last, I already said it in my speech, because of is the fact that common criteria is recognized in 17 countries. And when you have basically a smart meters in those countries which have not an own certification schema for smart meter in place, you actually should use this certification schema, and that obviously translates then directly into economical benefit for the utilities, but also for us as a smart meter industry.
Thank you. Any other?
But just to complete, I think that the cost and the right certification, it's depend on the type of product we have and which risks we want to cover. I think if we want to consider global, the global system, or if we want just to consider the component of the product, I think the choice of the right certification is very important, and after will be linked to the price, the cost.
Okay, anyone else from the panel on this before we go to the next question? Okay, we go back to the e-privacy, Bettina. So we heard a lot about regulations, Cybersecurity Act, e-privacy regulation, GDPR. So the question is, now we have GDPR in place, we have Cybersecurity Act in place. Now the Commission is working on e-privacy regulation. Where do we say we reach the limit? So do we really need more regulation, or where can we be happy and can we work with the existing regulation? So that's the question also for the panel is, again, this whole session was, we started with regulation, then we are going to talk about, we talked about how do we link our work to that regulation. Do we say enough is enough, or do we need an e-privacy regulation?
So I'm a lawyer, so can say the more regulation, the safer my job. So,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But to be honest, I think what we need is a balance. So I think we have a lot of regulation and we need a future-proof regulation. And in some cases, it can make sense to have new legislation or new regulation in place. For example, if it comes to have a common basis on access to data and finding a common basis to establish more innovative products. But on the other hand, what I think is what we need more than just new regulation is more education for the people. So a lot of people don't trust all this digital stuff because they don't understand what's behind it. So I think that we need more education on all people so that they understand it and have more more trust in what it's on the market.
Okay, thanks. Slavik?
So well, what I wanted to say on this subject is that we are living in a very fast-changing world. So I think that this story with continuous changes of legislation will never stop, because basically we are still living in the changes happen so quickly that basically this legislation that was quite okay a couple of years ago will soon outdated. This happened with the privacy directive at the beginning. Well, it was not a very long time ago, because we are speaking about the end of the 90s. And still, with the advent of the internet, this directive became completely obsolete and had to be changed. And actually, the work on introducing new regulation like GDPR took a long time. Now the same happens with the e-privacy directive that is already outdated, let's say, and this is from 2002. And probably, with an IS directive that is very accurate at this moment, we don't know what will happen in a couple of years. The same with Cybersecurity Act and with certification framework is, let's say, thought from the beginning in a scalable manner. So basically, this is like an umbrella, what I was saying, and then it depends on the schemes, let's say, how they will be constructed. But still, I think that legislation will need corrections and will need to be updated almost continuously.
Okay, thanks.
But then I don't know if it's really fast enough. So if we have a look at the privacy regulation, for example, the process started in 2017. So the first proposal from the Commission was in 2017. When we have luck, it will come into force in 2020. So if we see what was the development in the last 3 years, we are talking about technical status on 2017. So I think what we need is a smarter and more future-proof legislation then and regulation. And somehow I think to adopt and to renew current legislation is not having more legislation in place on every single topic which raises. So I think we should focus on the legislation we have, make it more smarter, make it more future-proof, but we have to think about if we need so much legislation and regulation on every single topic.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else on this topic? Again, if there are no questions from the audience, I don't see hands, then we continue with our list. And the next one is about, again, going back to the Cybersecurity Act and certification. I think Slavek explained, well, we are working on this framework. The Cybersecurity Act is not mandating certification, it is voluntary. So what's your opinion on this? Should it be voluntary, or should we more expect a kind of push for the sector to really certify products, yes or no? Is it a good thing that it is voluntary? Second question is related to that. According to me, if I didn't read the whole Cybersecurity Act, but I got questions about we already have an approach. So now suddenly there is a new approach, a new framework, a new scheme. What happens with the existing approaches? And I think, but I'm not sure, I think I read in the Cybersecurity Act that it says if there is a European framework and if there is a European scheme, if there is a European certification approach, you have to stop using your national one. So at least it's not still not obligation, no obligation to do certification, but if you want to do certification, you use the adopted European approach. So, what is your opinion on that? Is it wise or is it not wise? Should we go further than that? Who wants to answer this one? Slavik?
So actually both topics are, let's say, quite an object of assessment from our side, from ENISA and European Commission. So coming back to the first question about let's say the aspect whether the certification should be obligatory, should be mandatory or not. The framework itself is considered being only voluntary, on voluntary basis. So if somebody is offering services, if somebody is manufacturing products, he does not have to certify them. But it also says that if the national legislation or European legislation mandates usage of certain certificates for specific usage, then of course, somebody who is not certifying his products will not be able to sell them. Because, these certificates will be searched by the market. The same with, for example, if we go to public procurement and if we have systems that and public entities that would like to buy some systems, some components, and probably I can imagine a situation where actually one of the criteria for the tender would be that the system will be certified according to a certain scheme. So on one hand, this whole framework is voluntary. On the other hand, it can be mandatory. Also, if the national legislation, because there is also a passage on this in the Cybersecurity Act, that if certain areas will have to be certified, then will have. So that's let's say one thing. Also, when it comes to your second question, which was about the
if there is a European framework and if there is a European scheme and there are existing national solutions, then according to me, the Cybersecurity Act indicates that you have to use the European approach.
Yeah. So a lot of member states already have some solutions, for example, for cloud computing. So in France and in Germany, there are two schemes that are basically excluding itself. They are completely based on different approach, and well, maybe not completely, but other things are evaluated in other way. So basically, these schemes are not compatible. In such case, if we one day receive a request for elaborating a certification scheme on the cloud, we will need to find a common solution, because indeed, if there will be a common European scheme on a certain topic, then the national schemes will need to cease to exist. Now, like an example, consensus will be always very difficult to find, because of course it also depends on the uptake of the market of specific scheme. Because if one scheme will be used on large scale, then of course it will be very difficult to stop it from one day to another. One thing that is also mentioned in the Cybersecurity Act is that the certificates that were issued according to national schemes will not lose validity. So basically they will be valid until the end of their validity, and if they were granted without the validity term, then I think that the Act foresees 5 years of their existence. Still, there will be for sure. So actually, I mentioned cloud. The European Commission, for example, organized a group on the cloud that is called CSP Cert, that actually was working on a common scheme on certification of the cloud. This scheme was almost achieved, so we received also a kind of draft of this scheme with some general directions how this scheme should look like. And this was a very difficult task actually to put together the French, the German, and also the huge part of the industry to sit together and to come out with a solution. But they managed, so I'm kind of optimistic in this respect that the consensus will be able to achieve. Now it's not only the question of putting these concurrent views there, but also on engaging as many stakeholders as possible. On the other hand, also I can imagine the situation where not all areas will be standardized. I mean, standardized in a way that not everything will be aligned, meaning that there will be still some areas that will be left to the member states to decide whether they want to continue with their own certification or we go for a European one. If there will be if it will seem to be impossible to find out a solution for already existing solutions, then I can imagine that it could stay like this.
Okay, thanks. Mario?
So, just to comment on the first question that you made, we have been debating this for a while. Sorry, is it better?
Yeah.
Okay, right. So this is something that we also discussed on the GRC. Is we also can start looking at process, typically development process, on certifying the process on creation for creating new products, and having those products self-assessed. It could help smooth the process and allow a larger quantity of products come to market with a good level of security and in a fast pace of changes that would support innovation and a lot of things. So this is something that we were discussing lately quite a lot, and we consider this as a very good opportunity for the discussion as well.
Just to come back also regarding the part one of the question, I fully agree with you. It is clear that cybersecurity is not mandatory and it is a voluntary scheme. But now, more and more, some markets are driven by some other requirements and need to apply cybersecurity. And I think in this way, the Cybersecurity Act and cybersecurity requirement can be a good way and can be used for that. The other part also we need to consider is that, as you know, there is a lot of regulation in Europe driven by CE marking, by a lot of European directives. And some of those directives are also starting to and want to implement cybersecurity requirement inside the previous requirement. It is a case of RED directive, RED, radio equipment directive, machinery directive, soon also electric low voltage directive. And I think in this way, the Cybersecurity Act can be a very good way to keep and catch some requirement defined inside.
Okay. Thanks. Anyone else? Yeah, Jörg, you wanted to add something?
I think for the first part, what's also an important point is a risk assessment. We're not talking about shall it be mandatory or voluntary. It's based on the risk assessment. What is the impact if something happens to individuals, to organization, to the society, which basically should drive a decision whether something should be mandatory or optional. I think for smart grid, we already have a consensus reached in the last 10 years that it's mandatory. That's also the reason why governments imply that. For other parts, it may be different. The tricky part comes then when we all understand we are in a connected world, and it becomes more and more difficult to see the different aspects of technical solutions as an island, because then somehow they are connected. So a part in one island could become an entry door for another island which is connected through the connected world. So in that sense, it becomes tricky to really say, is it mandatory or not, because the assessment, risk assessment, cannot be done in isolation. So
right, yeah.
I would just like to add one statement, let's say, to this question of mandatory voluntary. The Cybersecurity Act foresees that in a period of 3 years, the Commission will assess actually which areas should be mandatory. It does not oblige actually the Commission to choose any of these areas, but the Commission will lead some talks and discussions and will take a stock of, say, the current situation and can decide within the period of 3 years actually of putting obligation of certification in specific areas.
Okay. That leads me to my final question. Unless there is somebody else, last chance in the audience. very last chance to ask something, and otherwise you can still approach these people individually if you wish. If there is no question from the audience, then my last one is linked to this one. That is, so if you have this certification in place, what would be it may be even a step before that. What would be the role of the different stakeholders? Because we are here, we have ECSO, an organization working on approaches. We have ENISA working on framework, but then we have a utility, we have a manufacturer, we have a testing laboratory. In the development of these frameworks, development of certification approaches, what would be the role you see for yourself or for these stakeholders? Do you say, well, we'll see until it's ready and then we will adopt it, or do you want to be involved from the very beginning? How is ENISA taking care of the different stakeholders? So maybe you can give some answer on that, your thoughts. Role of stakeholders. Mario, can you start?
Yes, thank you. I think this is really a very important thing. If there's no dialogue between the different stakeholders, we're not going to achieve anything at all. So this has to be discussed with all the different parties. This means manufacturers, constructors, and the governance in between these things to make sure that we have something that rolls out properly, fits the market and customers. Mm-hmm. So there is a fine-tuning to be made here. And the step forward is the dialogue, precisely this type of dialogue that we have representatives of everyone around the table that can move forward. So at least is my opinion on the topic.
Okay.
I think regarding from outside, the role of TIC, text testing, certification and inspection, is to have something which can be representative of certification, and by using a referential, a technical referential. You know, I think our role in terms of certification body is to be able to provide something which are harmonized and well recognized, and will facilitate also the manufacturer, the vendor to access the market with something which can take into account the global level of security depending of the characteristic and the functionality of the product.
Okay, thanks.
I absolutely agree in that sense that only when we work together we can find a good balance between risk, attacks, attack vectors, and basically the measure against it for us as industry to acceptable costs to everybody. Because at the end of the day, it's not it's cost which basically goes then back to the society in one way or the other.
I agree on what you say. So I think it's always better to be part of the creating a new idea than just adopt what other people are thinking. So I think to have a dialogue and to be involved to get all the approaches and all the know-how together is the best you can do.
So the whole framework of certification was thought as much open, inclusive and transparent as possible. So basically we as ENISA, we plan to be open, transparent and inclusive while elaborating the schemes. Apart from this, we also have one role that I did not mention during my presentation, but it's also advising and providing guidelines on certification in general. This means also interacting with stakeholders, gathering their opinions, and then putting them forward. So, I think we are all agreeing on the fact that we have to talk with each other, and we have to maintain this dialogue between the stakeholders in order to gain good results.
Okay, thanks. Okay, before I conclude, is there any message from your side that you would like to convey that we did not discuss, or question that you would like to discuss? Or are you happy with what we discussed so far? Happy? Audience happy? Good. let me thank the panel and the speakers for their presentations again. Thank you for attending this session. And again, if there are any further questions, you know who to approach for the topics that we were discussed today. Thank you for your attention.